American Soybean Association and the president of the Kentucky Livestock Coalition. He joins us now to discuss the impact of President Trump's tariff policies. Caleb, thanks so much for...
In the middle of the ocean, 49 U.S. soybean shipments were stopped. $1. In a matter of hours, $1 billion worth of contracts disappeared, and Brazil left with billion-dollar agreements. Was this the time America's farm belt was exposed on the international scene, or was it just trade chaos? One of the most severe falls in the history of the U.S. soybean trade occurred in April 2025. Halfway over the Pacific, a cargo ship loaded with American soybeans was abruptly ordered to change course. The cause was as devastating as it was shocking. All U.S. soybean supplies were abruptly canceled by China. The signal illuminated Singapore's trading terminals by noon, and within hours, billions of contracts have been reduced to dust. The market for wheat, corn, and soybeans are currently up against fierce international competition. It comes from Brazil, which is why American companies have been bringing beans into the country. The extent of the cancellation was astounding. Bungie, just this week. Nearly 2. American farmers were left surprised and stranded when 4 million tons of soybeans were abruptly transferred to Brazil. A deteriorating trading relationship was symbolized by 49 shipments that were already in transit. Cargo wasn't the only factor. It was about dependability, trust, and a well-thought-out international strategy. The total amount of losses was $1. In a single day, $1 billion worth of agriculture contracts were lost. Brazil is already losing out to nations like China that are investing in their agriculture sector. What are some of the responsibilities you will have? Furthermore, this was not a coincidental logistical error for Washington. Beijing was sending a clear and intentional signal that trade may be used as a weapon at any time. China retaliated at one of America's weakest areas, its farmers, while the U.S. thought it could exert pressure on China by imposing duties on industrial and technology exports. It was more than simply a financial setback. It was a right-wing political one at the rural states that make up the agricultural core of the United States. The shock of the abrupt rejection extended well beyond the ports and farms. Soybean futures fell nearly immediately as traders on Wall Street rushed to adapt to the upheaval. The Pentagon also paid attention. It was more than just a market loss. The subject was being put to the test. In addition to raising concerns about agriculture, it also calls into question how resilient the U.S. economy is in a trade war when your biggest customer is able to cancel mid-delivery. Last week, 50 cargoes of Brazilian soybeans were also delivered. Due to inadequate storage, their record soybean crop, which is 91% harvested, is badly undercutting and flooding the export market. Fundamentally, the denial demonstrated how reliant American farmers had grown on China's enormous demand for soybeans. China had been the biggest consumer for years, consuming almost 1/3 of all American exports. The U.S. was exposed as a result of that dependence, and Beijing skillfully took advantage of that vulnerability in April 2025. By shifting its focus to Brazil, China showed that it didn't require as many U.S. soybeans as Washington believed. There was more to this event than just a disturbance in trade. It marked a sea change in agricultural strategy worldwide. One was seen in the U.S. 1 billion disappeared in a matter of hours, but the long-term effects were more profound. Everybody involved, from farmers to financial analysts, saw that this was about more than just soybeans as the two economic titans of trust broke down. It served as a reminder that international trade might change suddenly. When it does, without a contingency plan, entire industries can collapse. When tariffs are mentioned, prices tend to drop. Many Americans don't realize that farmers don't set the markets. We are price takers. The actual suffering occurred in silence in the American heartland, while the rejected supplies made headlines. Years of labor were undone in a few days for farmers in Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska. At the same time, the prices of 3 commodities that support family farms, wheat, corn, and soybeans, were falling. It was more than simply a rough week. The crisis put livelihoods in jeopardy. The issue was brutally evident in the USDA's April report. The 13% increase in unsold soybean stocks was the largest April increase since 2019. Farmers who were already making extremely thin ends met with storage expenses as silos filled up more quickly than they could be drained. With no obvious market ready to take it in, a crop intended for exporters was suddenly stalled in the United States. The blow came instantly at the Chicago Board of Trade. Soybean spot pricing fell by 2% within a week of the cancellations, wiping down $470 million in value. Those figures weren't just numbers to farmers. They made the difference between planting another season and permanently closing down, between repaying loans and failing. The mid-season shutdown was more devastating than anyone could recall in a sector where timing is crucial. As the realities hit rural villages, farmer feeling fell apart. Over and over again came the same phrase. Without any backup plans, we were shut out in the middle of the season. For many, it felt more like economic isolation than a trade conflict. Suddenly, generations of farmers who had depended on exports as a safety net were left with no way forward and forced to face overcrowded silos and declining prices. The crisis exposed the true fragility of the safety net. For a long time, American farmers relied on consistent demand from China to maintain a stable business. They were left vulnerable to erratic local markets that were unable to handle the excess without it. It was a particularly harsh blow to small and mid-sized farmers. These weren't international companies. Being family-run businesses, they were susceptible to all changes in world politics. The timing only made things worse. It's not just another quarter from April to June. U.S. soybean exports usually account for about 40% of yearly earnings during this prime export window. Losing access during that busy time of year was like cutting off air just when it was most needed. Not all farmers were losing money. Their enterprises' foundations, and for many, their futures were being lost. This was not just an economic disaster. It shattered a generation-old way of life and identity. Market downturns, floods, and droughts have all been experienced by the U.S. Farm Belt. However, this was not like the others. This was not a natural occurrence. It was a calculated move. And the message was painfully obvious to the farmers who were caught in the midst. Their means of subsistence served as negotiating chips in a more extensive geopolitical game, such as wheat, cereals, fruits, and tree nuts. John Boyd has joined me. He owns a farm and serves as the head of the Black Farmers National Association. Many thanks for being here, John. The April 2025 crisis wasn't a singular incident. A slow-burning trade war that had been brewing for years led to it. The Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs on China on March 10th, imposing a 20% levy on metals, electronics, and parts for electric vehicles. The goal was to show Beijing that Washington was willing to use economic pressure to get concessions before the next round of trade negotiations. However, rather than retreating, China launched back with accuracy, imposed a 34% retaliatory tariff on all U.S. goods going into China in response to Trump's import levies. Within weeks, Beijing countered by putting a 34% tariff on all U.S. agricultural imports, which could have a significant negative impact on one industry. There was more to this than numbers. It was a clear jab at the agricultural region of America, which had helped propel Trump to power. China knew just where to shoot. Beijing's targeting of wheat, corn, and soybeans wasn't merely a way to America's economy. Rural voters were receiving a political message that Washington's policies were jeopardizing their means of subsistence. Farmers perceived this reprisal as a betrayal by uncontrollable forces. They had less influence over metal and electronics tariffs. But all of a sudden, their crops found themselves in the center of a geopolitical conflict. Overnight, contracts worth billions of dollars vanished, and soybeans stacked up in silos with no purchasers. Beijing sent a clear message. China could weaponize trade if Washington so desired. Additionally, the timing of these actions made the damage much more acute, as they had a catastrophic effect on those closest to Trump's electoral base. U.S. farmers were getting ready for their busiest export window around March and April. It was no seasonal annoyance to lose China in those months. The financial situation was disastrous. Due to the retribution, several growers were unable to repay their loans. Planting timetables were occasionally thrown into the mix, and equipment updates had to be postponed. Uncertainty swept across agrarian villages like wildfire. Officials in Washington attempted to minimize the impact by referring to the tariffs as a short-term setback. But there was no denying the agony on the ground. Banks started to doubt farm loan extensions, futures markets were unstable, and small-town economies that depended on agriculture prepared for downturns. After supporting Trump in 2016 and 2020, farmers began to wonder whether they had been reduced to bargaining pieces in a game too big for them to control. Brazil was already filling the void as the U.S. struggled with canceled shipments and plummeting prices. Years of meticulous planning went into what appeared to be swift opportunism. Brazil increased its soybean acreage by over 21% between 2020 and 2024. That growth wasn't a coincidence. It was supported by billions of dollars in investments aimed at making Brazil the world's largest supplier of soybeans. Ahead of the tariff truce's expiration tomorrow, U.S. President Trump is urging China to triple U.S. soybean orders. Fresh duties related to China's acquisition of Russian oil. An important factor in this change was China. Even plus. During that time, $2 billion poured into Brazil's agricultural infrastructure. Santos and other major ports saw the expansion of their grain terminals. From Mato Grosso, the nation's soybean heartland, To the coast, freight links were improved. The Fara Railway, which was founded by Chinese state banks, was the project's crown jewel and cut the time it took to get from farmland to ports by 42%. This investment revolutionized farming in Brazil. Crop transportation through the vast interior had always been expensive and time-consuming. Soybeans might travel more effectively with new railroads and enlarged roadways, establishing Brazil as a trustworthy rival to the U.S. Brazil was not only prepared, but also eager to take over when China stopped importing from the U.S. in 2025. Soybeans were informed that the premium under the May contract was around $2. Thus, that's a fairly big discount there, you know? We've gotten quite aggressive with that now. Many onlookers were taken aback by the pivot's quickness. Chinese customers moved supplies to Brazil within hours of the U.S. cancellations. In order to get Brazilian soybeans, traders reported that China was even prepared to pay premiums ranging from $14 to $22 per ton. Price wasn't the only consideration. It was about establishing confidence with a supplier who had demonstrated their dependability. Farmers in Brazil profited, and China's approach paid off with ease. Supply continuity. This was more than just a trade move behind the scenes. The tactic was geopolitical. China acquired control over vital supply routes and lessened its reliance on U.S. commodities by integrating itself into Brazil's infrastructure. Beijing was purchasing more than simply soybeans, as seen by its investments in ports, railroads, and storage facilities. The mechanism that moved them was being shaped by it. Contracts and tariffs were only one aspect of that type of impact. For the growth of Brazil and the U.S. served as a sobering reminder of lost chances. Brazil was covertly increasing capacity with foreign assistance, while American farmers depended on infrastructure that had been in place for decades and presumed China's allegiance. Brazil did more than simply replace U.S. soybeans when the crisis struck. It went so well, demonstrating the success of China's long-term diversification strategy. Soybeans rank first among U.S. farm exports to China. Ashley Sear of Fox 6 demonstrates the effect on the Badger State right now. Arrive here at around 6:30 a.m. Doug Reed, the abrupt cancellation in China was shocking not only because of what happened, but also because of when it happened. The most lucrative time of year for U.S. soybean exports is March through June, a season that typically produces about 40% of the crop's yearly income in America. Contracts are at their highest, ports are at their busiest, and farmers are finally rewarded for months of toil. China attacked at the most vulnerable time conceivable by withdrawing in the middle of this window. Tariff on goods from the U.S. There is discomfort, according to Reed, who is also the president of the Wisconsin Soybean Association.